Good afternoon. So the audience who are here today and who are listening from outside. So today we are very fortunate to have Mr. Devine. He's the CTO and VP of IBM. So now he will give us a wonderful talk on the perfect storm of the future, and how it relates to mobility. We are very glad to have back.
Thank you,
as our speaker.
All right, thank you. So I entitled my presentation "The Perfect Storm" because I've been working for IBM now for 30 years, and I've never seen the technical dynamics and the market dynamics line up like I have recently. And so I want to talk about this convergence that's happening. And so if you look at my abstract here, perfect storm is a rare combination of forces leading to an event of unusual magnitude. Like Superstorm Sandy was considered a perfect storm. Right? And whenever you have a perfect storm as it takes to technology, it really forces you into a problem that you have to solve and a potential solution to that problem. And the problem that we have here is data. You have more and more connected devices, greater amount of data, and more geographic distribution. And we'll talk about this geographic distribution. Think about that as not just bound by Earth anymore either. We'll talk about some of the space tech stuff that we're seeing. But the impact, the potential impact of this is huge. You have all of these things adding to the complexity of an already complex network. And then you have things like security, privacy, and data insights that are dragging down your ability to do things in an innovative, open way. So how do you manage that? How do you manage this onslaught of devices and onslaught of data? It's really interesting. When I go and talk to a large enterprise customer, they always have that big data strategy. But when I ask them what their big data strategy is, it's really a strategy around trying to handle the volume of data, right? Snapshots of data, samples of data, but how big is the snapshot? How fast, how often do you need to get that data? And so you look at kind of the traditional way that data is processed. Most of the big data kind of projects still fall into this category where it's mostly batch in its orientation, a traditional processing of data, and it takes weeks or at least days in order for humans to go crank through that data and figure out what it really means. When in reality, more and more use cases today are following this continuum over here to the far right, where you have streaming analytics, complex event processing, and kind of the undiscovered territory that I want to focus on is this aspect of cognitive AI, right? You have, in 2020, there are going to be 44 zettabytes of data, right? That's 10 to the 21st power, right? Humans can't handle that volume. They also can't handle the speed. Data loses its value in milliseconds. 90% of the data today that people have, they don't use because they can't get value from it fast enough for it to make a real difference. And so if you can get to a point where you can make objective decisions in real time, that's when you really can take advantage of the fact that you have more connectivity than ever before, more data than ever before. But until you can do that, you have a significant problem. So let's break this down. So if you look at traditional way enterprise IT was done, it was done in a central fashion. It's been done this way since the beginning of the internet. We have centralized servers delivering content to remote clients. Okay? And in the early days of the internet, we had real problems with scale. And so companies like Akamai came around and pushed content out to the edge, right? And so you had static content, things that didn't change a lot, were delivered closer to the clients, right? But it was still very much a north-south oriented architecture. It was very centralized, right? With the number of devices that are in play today and the need to do decisions in real time, you can't go and continue, in my opinion, to have this centralized approach. You know, you have too much volume of data, you need to move too quickly to make decisions. You need to move to a peer-to-peer decentralized open architecture. This aspect of, you hear the term IBM all the time talks about multi-cloud, edge-enabled AI, all right? And so our assertion is that the world that we live in is going to be a decentralized, open AI world. And you're going to use AI to get the value of the data in real time. And it's going to be open and it's going to be decentralized. So you've got to move from that very centralized model to a decentralized model. And this is very difficult because it took 30 years for large companies that have been around 30 years. They built up people, paper, process, etc. that is set up with the older model, with the centralized model. So moving to a decentralized model, the first question that I always, when I go out and talk to customers is, figure out why you're doing something. The problem that we have today is, in most enterprise IT shops, they're trying to do everything, right? When in reality, some tasks can best be done by others, you just need to consume them. So instead of building everything themselves with customized software, how can they consume services and only focus on the real differentiation, why they're doing something? And then figure out, okay, why am I doing it? Then you figure out, okay, I know why I'm doing it. Now figure out how to do it, and then figure out what that really is. And this statement by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, repetition does not transform a lie into a truth. And the reason why I put that statement there is I can't tell you how many times that I've had conversations with a CIO or a CTO, and they'll say, he or she will say, well, this is our best practice. And I'll say, well, how long have you been doing your best practice? And they'll say, for 10 years. I'm like, okay, is your business just like it was 10 years ago? And they'll say, no. I said, is technology the same as it was 10 years ago? And they'll say, no. And then I say, well, how do you know that today the best practice is really the best practice? Just because it worked 10 years ago, it might have been the absolute perfect thing to do 10 years ago. But how do you know that it's right today, right? Because change is difficult, right? Because there's so many different tasks you've got to do. And this is why things like cloud computing give you the ability to consume things as a service, so you no longer had to build and operate them yourself, right? And so figure out what is key and focus on that. And this is the other problem. See, this is the greatest chart ever made, I think, all right? Because simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, is what Leonardo da Vinci said, and I think that's absolutely true. People try to make things too complicated, all right? You start simple. Simplicity wins. When you look at some of the services that have been most successful in the marketplace, they weren't necessarily the most functionally complex solution or the most technically beautiful solution. They were simple. They were consumable, right? And so when companies try to transition from this centralized north-south orientation of their architecture to a decentralized architecture, there's so many different things. The idea is start simple. Don't make it overly complicated. Start simple, keep it simple. Focus on consumability. Right? The other thing that's important is this aspect of a minimum viable product. Right? So we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the moonwalk, so I put a Neil Armstrong quote down here. When in doubt, just take the first small step, or the next small step. This is one of the biggest problems that large enterprise customers have, is they will try to do too many things too quickly, right? And they'll try to deliver this day one, when in reality, their customers would be happy in the initial stages with something that's not as complex, but it's workable, right? Many times when they break down a complex solution, they make the mistake of breaking it down into components that aren't usable. So you hear a lot about microservices architecture and containerization, right? That's a great way of breaking things down to consumable chunks. But each of those microservices needs to have value on its own, right? If you truly are going to go to a microservices architecture, you can't have something that doesn't really function on its own. Now, this brings me to open. So this is particularly true in certain industry verticals. There's still very much proprietary, protect intellectual property. So I go back to my statement about data. To me, it's all about data. Data is the real value of the enterprise, right? But many times an enterprise customer will treat data like gold. It's locked in a vault, and only people that have the combination are allowed to come up and stare at the beautiful gold in the vault, right? What data needs to be is more like oil. It gets its value from being able to be used, right? And so one of the challenges that people have is if they're trying to do a proprietary system and they're trying to develop everything themselves, they're going to be outpaced by the competition that's consuming services and utilizing open source, right? I remember the very early days of open source in Linux, right? The prevailing thought at the time is, oh, this is a passing fad that it won't last. Because the thought was, if you're putting stuff out in the open source, then everybody's going to be able to use it, or it's going to be less secure. Well, the exact opposite happened, right? It was more secure because there was more eyes on it, right? There was more innovation because people were able to take building blocks from others and build new and interesting things, right? And so enterprise customers that haven't embraced an open strategy are significantly in jeopardy of not lasting over the next 4 or 5 years, right? And so it's a very important thing. So you probably saw IBM acquired Red Hat, which was the largest acquisition that IBM ever made. It's a $34 billion acquisition. Because we believe so strongly in this aspect of an open, transparent community really unleashes innovation. Now, the other thing that's important besides this openness is this aspect of artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence is not a new thing. It's been around for a long time, right? So what makes it different today than it was before? This explosion of data. You have to be able to train models, and models need data. So if you don't have data, you can't train a model that's very accurate, right? You also have sophisticated algorithms, machine learning, and reasoning that are happening in the open source. You have collective minds or crowdsourcing new and interesting ways of analyzing data. And then you also, because of cloud computing, you now can, quote, tap into infinite capacity. So let me give you an example. So I was working with a large hospital system, and I was asked, this was 5 years ago, I was asked 5 years ago to go see their CIO to talk about cloud computing, right? And the CIO, he's a nice guy. He welcomed me, he told me about what they did at the hospital and all that. But he said, we'll never ever use the public cloud. All right? So it was a kind of a dud meeting, if you will, because I was a public cloud guy, right? And then 6 months later, I get asked by the account team to come talk to the same guy. I'm like, why? He obviously wasn't interested. He's like, no, things have changed. So I go there, and he says, well, we're a little tight on data center capacity, so I just want the non-essential stuff to go to the public cloud. Just the essential stuff I'll keep on-prem. So we talked through that. And then I get asked about 6 months after that to come back to talk to the same gentleman again. I'm like, okay, well, what's this time? He said, I'm getting out of the data center business. I'm doing everything on the public cloud. So in a year's time, he went from not wanting to do anything on the public cloud to doing everything on the public cloud. And I said, well, what happened? He said, so darn soap dispensers. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's a hospital system, all right? So he has soap dispensers, and it has sensors in the soap dispenser that count the people in the operating room. And the number of people in the operating room aren't the same as the number that's scrubbed on the smart soap dispenser, an alarm goes off. And it's saving the hospital like lots of insurance dollars because they can prove that you didn't get an infection because somebody didn't scrub, right? And so he said, you have any idea the amount of data that those soap dispensers in my hospital system send out? He ran out of data center capacity because of soap dispensers. He knew it was a lost cause. So having the ability to actually tap into public compute, public infrastructure, gives us the ability to do things that we weren't able to do before because we were limited in terms of the capacity that we had. And so this gives us an opportunity to blend human intelligence with AI. And so if I can make decisions based in real time, and I can complement the human element to that. So let me give you a great example. So you guys may or may not know, IBM bought the weather company. So the weather company was the data and analytics division within the Weather Channel, right? And we did that about 5 years ago. And so I had the privilege of starting that process on the IBM side to acquiring the Weather Channel. And the reason why we did that was weather is the largest data set in the world, and weather data has some aspects that no other data set has, that it's completely open, right? And everybody's willing to share their location on their mobile phone so they can get local weather. So it's a very unique data set, right? But what was interesting, in the first meeting I had with the CIO of the weather company, he was telling me about how they got started. And, you know, there's been a long history between weather and aviation. So they were talking to one of the U.S. Airlines, putting additional sensors on the plane, right? They already gave weather forecasts, but what they wanted to do was put sensors on the plane to measure turbulence. And they wanted to use AI to determine whether the turbulence was more than was necessary. You know, it was to a certain point where they needed to put the plane into maintenance, right? And the response by the airline was classic. They said, we don't need that because our pilots are the best in the business, right? And so the weather company says, well, why don't we give you the sensors free, and we'll monitor the sensors for a year, and we'll tell you what you would have saved if you listened to the data instead of your pilots. Well, the company had nothing to lose because they had no cost, so they said, sure. Right? Well, this is what they found at the end of the first year, right? When they did the analysis of the data, the pilots that had a military background were constantly underestimating turbulence. Ones from the civilian background were constantly overestimating turbulence. Whenever you underestimate turbulence, what do? When you're underestimating turbulence, you're not putting a plane into maintenance that should have been put in because they flew through the turbulence. What about if you overestimate the turbulence, where you're flying planes around turbulence, unnecessarily wasting gas, etc.? When they factored in all of the cost in terms of risk and extra cost of maintenance unnecessary or fuel that was unnecessary, they came up with $10 million a month that they would have saved if they listened to the data instead of the pilots. Right? Now, you would think that pilots would be very happy about getting replaced by an AI engine, but it was the exact opposite. The pilots embraced this because they knew that they were subjectively just, on a scale. I don't know what the actual scale was, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it's 1 to 10, and if the turbulence is over 5, then you had to put it in maintenance. Well, think about the pressure on the pilot. You know, is that a 5 or a 6? Right? Because it makes a big difference. Right? So taking that burden off of the humans so they could focus on the safety of their passengers and the safety of their plane was actually a relief. Right? We've seen this same kind of thing happen where a blend of human intelligence and AI in healthcare, same thing. Right? My wife Karen is a double organ transplant recipient. Right? And I've never been in the hospital, almost never been sick. Right? So I think it's hilarious when the doctor asks me if I stumped my toe or something, pain threshold of 1 to 10. I'm more likely to say, oh, it's a 7. My wife, who's been through all this, she used to say it's like a 2. Right? It's completely subjective. Right? The thing about real-time data, you can use AI and real-time data and train your models. You take the subjectivity out of the equation, and you can make objective decisions. And then the humans can take the objectivity and make even better decisions with them. Right? So that's where the real power of the combination comes. Now, I remember when the internet started. Yes, I'm that old, right? And there was a big, hype cycle, if you will, around the internet. And I remember Linux, right? And I remember cloud computing. And I remember IoT. I have never seen such hype in my life as I have around blockchain technology that was underneath things like cryptocurrency, right? Blockchain is a decentralized architecture. It's a peer-to-peer decentralized architecture. And it has the potential to fundamentally change business processes. I recently gave a keynote at the IoT Slam event in Raleigh a couple of weeks ago, and I was the keynote for the health section of that conference. And when you look at what happens in healthcare today, in healthcare, you're buried under people, paper, and process. We spend 4.5 billion faxes in the U.S. alone. faxes, paper faxes, right? The archaic nature of our healthcare system is just buried in people paper process. When I moved, my wife and I recently moved from the Raleigh area to Clemson, right? Changing doctors was terrible because I had to fill out form after form with the same information, right? So the hospital, the healthcare system is just riddled with people, paper, and process. How do I make that digital, right? Especially in industry verticals that have very sensitive data and compliance, there's this real fear that somehow paper and process and people are more secure than data. So it reminds me very much of the whole story I just went through with the weather and the pilots, right? Humans make errors, they make mistakes, right? Now that doesn't say the software doesn't make mistakes, but when you have a lot of eyes on the software and you're making it better, over time it's repeatable, it's objective, you don't bring in subjectivity, it's going to be better. So this aspect of broader participation, lower cost, increased efficiency around this aspect of shared ledger, smarter contracts, and building a consensus, right? That's what's really powerful about blockchain. Now, blockchain as a technology is still fairly early in its maturation, right? But it has a great potential in terms of changing the way that we do things, whether that's a supply chain use case, like automotive supply chain is a great example of that. Lots of activity in the automotive companies around utilizing blockchain to ensure that parts get delivered to where they're supposed to, in the way that they're supposed to, and there's a chain of custody during each one of those handling. Right? And so the key point being is it's a decentralized architecture. It's a point-to-point architecture. And you're using an open source type techniques to validate things, right? This is driving a lot of work around the edge, right? So you go back to the example I was talking about in the early days of the internet, we had an edge. It was a very static edge. It was like the Akamai point of presence. And it was static cached content. You basically push that out, and then the browser just got the content from there. Unfortunately, we don't live in a static world today. We live in a very dynamic world. All right? So we need to be able to have dynamic content. We need to be able to do AI at the edges. Because we need to do real-time data, we need to inspect the real-time data, we need to be able to push the models out to the edge so that we can make adaptations to the models in real time. And so you have lots of use cases around industrial, in the enterprise, consumer, retail, and in particular, telco and 5G is really driving things out to the edge because they're going to have more compute, and going to have more bandwidth at the edge than ever before. So can I push intelligence out to the edge? Can I make decisions in real time at the edge? And so what we're seeing is people utilizing AI, they'll train their models, they'll create their models, and then push their models out to the edge of the network. And then they'll create a reinforced learning loop between the edge and the back-end systems to reshape the model in real time as they get more and more data. That's what we see, right? And so you're going to see more and more of that kind of an approach. Again, it's a decentralized point-to-point type of an architectural model that's driving things to the edge. And so you have this combination of AI, blockchain, and IoT coming together in real time so that you have things like governance and collaborative data exchange being controlled by blockchain, and you have AI providing objective insight and action-based analytics, right? And this is actually a chart that I had in my healthcare keynote that I did a couple of weeks ago. Because if you think about a healthcare ecosystem, you got a collection of very enterprise IT-savvy companies, Mayo, Johns Hopkins, etc. You know, insurance, State Farm, etc. Right? Geico, etc. And then you've got very small hospital systems, private practices that have no idea how to do any kind of enterprise IT, and they all have to collaborate together. Right? So this is where it comes really into what I was talking about before. The key is open, an open environment. You have to be able to exchange information in an open fashion for the collective good. And you have to be able to use decentralized architecture such that there's no one individual or set of individuals that can control things, because there's a complete lack of trust. When you look at, you know, one of the most difficult things to do in any kind of diverse ecosystem is to establish trust. How do I trust that you are going to play by the rules, right? How do I know that you're trustworthy? How do I know that you're going to keep my data, safe, etc., right? And so utilizing things like blockchain as the governance, it allows you to, based off the consensus of people in the chain, determine whether trust should be established or not, and then the rules, the terms and conditions in which you can trust. And then once you get this aspect of establishing trust, now you can start doing what we call an open data exchange, right? So again, going back to my example, instead of data being gold that you lock in a vault and only selected people can go walk up to the vault and stare at the beautiful gold, right? Data is like oil. I can put it out into use. I can make it useful in society, right? So the real opportunity here, this perfect storm I was talking about, is I have a very tech-savvy generation now. I mean, my kids all grew up with technology. They think I'm old as dirt because there wasn't an internet back when I was younger, right? And you have more power in your own cell phone than NASA had when it was working with IBM to send a man to the moon 50 years ago, right? So the amount of technology that we have, the amount of capabilities that we have, the tech savviness of what we have, the amount of data that we had to do things differently. Like going back to my example, I was talking about best practice. When every time a CIO or a CTO tells me that this is our best practice, and we've had this best practice for X number of years, I'm like, even if it was a best practice for X number of months, it could be completely wrong at this point. The amount of technology changes that are happening are significantly more than ever any point in time. So if you look at, if you ever watched the movie Jerry Maguire's Follow Money, right? In tech, you follow money, right? The VCs invest in things that are going to pay off for them, right? And they're very savvy at that. And what the VCs are investing in are companies that are built off of this elastic, scalable, decentralized architecture, right? Data companies that have a Lambda-style event-based kind of an approach, companies that are taking advantage of new technologies like blockchain, etc. That's where the investment's being made. If you're a VC and you see somebody that's investing in technology that assumes the same kind of capabilities that have existed for the last 30 years in a centralized fashion, then they're not going to get an investment, right? The investments are being made in this decentralized peer-to-peer world, and the technologies that we see that are being adopted in the open community follow that. So let's take an example of that. So the space tech industry. So here's the recent data. This is 2019. There's $22.3 billion of investment going into space. Right? Why? Why does that happen? It's because used to be space was done by folks like NASA in a very proprietary, closed way. And what happened? You had folks like Elon Musk with SpaceX, etc., that are starting to do things privatization in a very open way, right? And so that's forcing changes. That's actually forcing public-private partnerships to advance technology. And the cost of launching a satellite has significantly dropped as a result. So what you see is use cases that before would have been out of reach economically because they're just too expensive. Now all of a sudden, maybe, for example, right? Maybe I want to launch low orbiting satellites and use that as my logistics system now because I have a better perspective of the overall logistics than I do by getting siloed pieces of data from different telematics systems along the route, right? And so you see this massive interest in space tech and this massive investment coming. As illustrated by the startup landscape. These are startups in the space tech landscape that have emerged in the last, this is 2019, so the last two and a half years. Right? Unbelievable amount of startup investment. Right? Now, if you remember, I talked about the explosion of devices, the explosion of data, and then I talked about geodispersion. Right? Large multinational companies have always struggled with how do they get services in one geo equal to services in another geography. And cloud computing's helped that, etc. Right? But now you're talking about doing things in space. So now you're not just bound by the geography on Earth. Now you're doing things much more remote. So distances come into effect, right? You have this thing called the speed of light that you just simply can't get around, right? And so when you have services that need to collaborate with each other and they're further and further apart, you're going to be forced to take advantage of those new technologies that are decentralized. And so one of the things we did at the Satellite 2019 conference in May was we actually talked about the work we've been doing with a company, one of those startups that I had on the previous page, called Spacebelt. And think of them as a data repository in the sky. All right? So if you think about it, we're still bound by the amount of footprint that you have on the ground. All right? If I'm building a data center, even if I'm a cloud computing company, I've got to have land and I've got to build that data center. Right? What if I could just launch another satellite and have space as the final frontier of data is what we call the presentation, where a bunch of Star Trek means. Anyway, but the idea is that you can have the data in these low orbiting satellites. So basically they become mini data centers, micro data centers, mini data centers. And you look at the VCs are actually investing in these micro data center companies, whether it's this one, whether it's in space, or whether it's at aggregation of 5G, etc. Because there's going to be more and more compute. I mean, if you're familiar with NVIDIA, the compute power that it has in the GPU processors is amazing, right? The amount that it can do is amazing. So you have a smaller footprint that can do things that you weren't able to do before in a whole data center, right? So taking advantage of that, where those devices headed. Sending everything back to a central data center makes no sense when I have all that compute power at the edge. And when you serve a use case like space, there's no way that I'm going to be able to do that, right? It's just the distances are too great. So one of the projects that we're doing with NASA is on astronaut health, right? The mission to Mars, right? So we're planning the mission to Mars, and we're trying to figure out how we can use things like AI to ensure the health of the astronauts as they go to Mars and return, right? Well, how do you do that? How do you get data? How do you train that model? So we're actually using AI to train the models for the AI that we need, right? It's a very interesting project, okay? Those are the kind of innovations that you're going to see, right? And you're just seeing more and more investment in things that handle volume and velocity of data, and then you can handle insight from that data in real time, right? And you want to get to a point where you can make objective business decisions in real time. You're not bound by human error. You're not bound by capacity. You're not bound by best practices that have existed for X number of years, whatever. All right? And the key thing is you have to do things in an open environment. To survive this perfect storm of technology, you have to do things in an open way. Because if you do things in a proprietary closed way, then you're going to be left behind. Because there's power in the masses, this aspect of crowdsourcing technology, crowdsourcing new solutions. Right? So I wanted to save some time for questions. I know I went through a good number of things, but I wanted to have an opportunity for you guys, gals, to ask some questions. So any questions? Yeah.
Thank you for your great presentation. What's your take on ensuring the privacy in an open data sharing or like an open source platform?
Great question. So the question was about data privacy in an open environment. So one of the things that I have the privilege of doing at IBM is I'm not only the partnership executive for Clemson, but I'm also partnership executive for MIT. And we have a consortium that we've sponsored on the MIT side called the Trusted Data Consortium, right? And it's specifically focused on this aspect of protecting sensitive data, like healthcare data as an example, in this aspect of an open data exchange. We also are doing work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, around the combination of quantum with cybersecurity. So how can I make it such that I can also, in the quantum age to come, how I can make sure that I still have the ability to do data privacy, right? And so it is a challenge. And one of the things that we're doing is, one of the things about data privacy, the reason why the laws are written the way they are is, how do I establish trust? And so the trust is dictated by the geographic boundary, right? When you start doing things and needing to deliver things at the edge and needing to do things in an open, collaborative way, and maybe even not even just people on Earth, but entities that are in space, how am I going to do that? So I had to look at new and interesting ways of doing that. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at how we can establish trust, utilizing zero trust knowledge kind of algorithm kind of approach, and utilizing the blockchain to build consensus. So this aspect of doing things like identity-based consensus, make sure that I can establish trust where it didn't exist before, and then you and I programmatically agree to terms and conditions of how we're going to share the data. So maybe I'm only going to share the insight from the data instead of the actual data. Maybe I'm only going to share the models associated with the data. Maybe I'm only going to share based off of certain conditions, etc. Right? So if I can do that in real time, I can get much more granular, I can get much more dynamic in the way I can share it. So that's what we're doing inside that Trusted Data Consortium, is we're working with companies, understanding use cases, and then applying new technology to meet those use cases. Okay, that was a good question. Got another question? Yes?
So, you mentioned about one use of the blockchain should be like establishing like trust between all the components.
Sir, can you talk to me loudly, sir, because the audience from outside can.
I'll repeat it.
Okay.
Yes, so my question is that we heard that one use of blockchain is that establishing like a trust between the different components of the network. So other than that, is there like a specific application that the target is applying blockchain?
Yeah, so the question was about establishing trust across a set of entities utilizing blockchain. You might have seen some of the press activity we had around the food trust network that we set up working with Walmart, where basically for the food supply chain, we were ensuring that there was a chain of custody all along the way. All right. We also are doing things with international shipping, with our world trade lanes work that we're doing. So a lot of things around supply chain. Because if you think about supply chain, it's a perfect use case. Because what do you have in a supply chain? You have different entities, different companies, right, that have to collectively do a job to get it done, right? And the traditional way that supply chain is done is maddening, right? It's buried in people, paper, and processing again, right? There's a lot of manual steps, and it's very static. Let's say you're a company, and now all of a sudden you do things better than this company over here, but I have an established relationship with him on my supply chain today because of the static nature and the overhead with the people, paper, and process. I can't really switch over and use you as my new supply chain partner, even though you're significantly less cost and significantly better, right? But a new competitor coming up has no problem with that. So all of a sudden now I'm competitively disadvantaged because of the static overhead that I have. And so what we're trying to do with supply chain is to make it digitally enabled, utilizing blockchain to establish trust where it didn't exist before, and then I can digitally write contracts. And based off of change in conditions, like for example, a new supply chain partner, maybe in my contract I give you 30 days to prove to me that you're better than the person that I'm currently using, and if you are, then I'll switch over. If I can do that digitally, and I can record that audibly, then all of a sudden I have the freedom to do that, where before I didn't. So supply chain is a great set of use cases that we're doing for blockchain. So we're seeing that quite a bit. Anywhere that you have a diverse set of players. So healthcare is the other one we're seeing a lot of work. So we started, along with several other large health companies, what's called the Health Utility Network, which is using blockchain and AI together to solve some of the healthcare problems and make healthcare better. Other questions?
Yes, I have a question regarding edge computing. So, I mean, is IBM doing anything related to computational resource optimization in edge computing devices? For example, like if you put a device roadside, the computational power will be very low, right? So how we can optimize resource like cloud resource or edge devices resources based on the demand. So is IBM doing anything related to that?
Yes, the question was about edge, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so edge computing. So let's start with a definition of what edge is, okay? Because right now, there's lots of people that are thinking that edge equates to small devices or in an IoT use case only, right? From an IBM perspective, we consider an edge as any place there is a source of real-time data that I could potentially train an AI engine on, right? Could be a small device. It could be a completely different data center. It could be another cloud. It could be a micro data center or a 5G aggregation point. Wherever there's a source of real-time data that I could utilize to train my AI engine, that's what we consider an edge. So that's where our focus is, right? And so our focus is being able to use things like Kubernetes and Knative to actually push models to the edge and to use real-time reinforced learning at the edge to reshape the models. So this aspect of getting the real-time data. One of the reasons why we bought the weather company is that the weather company, because of the volume of weather data and the geographic dispersion of the weather data, years ago went to this decentralized AI model where they pushed intelligence out to the edge. Because that's the only way they can handle volume and the velocity and the accuracy of their models. Significantly improved when they did that, right? And so that's where our focus is. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
So we use the definition of edge as it's very close to the applications. So you're saying the same thing, right? With that.
Yeah, the reason why I didn't say applications, Ronnie, is most of the time when they consider applications, some of these devices are serverless. They're not really applications in the purest sense. There's event triggers that occur that causes a flow of information to happen. And so that's why I said anywhere there's a source of real-time data is what we consider an edge. Most of the time there's some kind of application, whether there's a mobile application or a data center application, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of a pure application.
I have a follow-up for another question. So what IBM is doing for the mobility sector, like the autonomous vehicles or so, in the mobility sector in general?
Yeah, so inside of IBM we have our global business solutions team. That is a set of consultants and that go and build applications and hire in solutions. And they have 12 industry verticals that GBS focuses on. Each one of those industry verticals, they will focus on use cases that are important for that particular industry vertical. So like perhaps, for example, in automotive, they have a whole practice around autonomous vehicles and working with the different parts of the automotive ecosystem on what do they need from an AI perspective, what do they need from a blockchain perspective, what do they need from a cloud computing perspective. So that's the groups, those industry teams inside of IBM that really focus on kind of industry vertical solutions. Then there's a set of development teams that focus more on kind of horizontal platforms that go across those different industries. So like a lot of the blockchain work is an example of a Hyperledger team, an IBM Hyperledger team. They will focus on building a Hyperledger platform that can be used by the industry teams to build industry solutions. But they're building kind of a horizontal platform, and then the industry teams basically take it the last 20% to make it specific to that particular industry. That's the way IBM is set up.
Sounds question. So you were talking about in sort of the weather application that they pushed a heavy amount of their computation sort of out to the edge where they were collecting all this data. So it's very easy to collect data, hard to actually do the computation. So is IBM looking at any ways to handle large amounts of data, compression, filtering data before?
Yeah, so our research teams in particular are always focused on trying to make it such that, we have teams over on the research side that are looking at how can you train AI with less data, so having the same accuracy from an AI standpoint but with less training data, right? And then we have another set of researchers that are focused on things like you're talking about where, okay, how can I increase the volume but process it near the origin of the data versus having to move it back. And so compression, trying to optimize bandwidth, trying to be able to have more efficient, effective, decentralized data services, etc. A lot of serverless architecture kind of focus. So all those things. It's a constant battle because one of the reasons why things were centralized to begin with was just because you had a small set of skills and a small set of compute that you could handle things, and then you didn't have that expertise out of the edge. And so that's why even large companies, when they had remote offices or branch offices, depending on the industry they were in, they typically just had bare bones out of the edge, right? Because the skills that were required to operate that, right? Because everything was operated, kind of manually. But now with automation and open source and the skill population being increased and the amount of bandwidth that's going to be available with 5G, you now kind of change that equation a good bit. But you have also folks like NVIDIA that are doing incredible work in terms of optimizing a very small footprint and the amount of compute. So you kind of have these forces, and this is what I talk about in the perfect storm. You got all these forces that make it possible for you to do things that you weren't able to do before. But you got to have an architectural model that you can adapt, because if something comes up that drastically changes the equation, and now I can do more at the edge than I was before, I need to be able to take advantage of it. And the problem with this north-south, kind of centralized model is it locked me into technology choices, and it locked me into vendors, and it locked me into a particular skill set. And so if something came that was new and interesting, I couldn't really take advantage of it. So this aspect of an open, scalable architecture that I can take advantage of that allows you to take advantage of new technologies. And the thing is, I remember back in the early days of the internet that we thought, when we got, when we stopped doing, call-up and we started having, cable into the house, we never needed any more bandwidth to do anything. So, the thing is, when you get new technology at the edge, it's going to be, gobbled up. So there's always invention that's going to have to happen in order to handle that kind of volume. Because there's no slow up in terms of the volume and the velocity of what you need to do. But the key is, if I'm not locked into an architecture that keeps me from adapting, then I can adapt with those changes.
Okay. Is there any question or comment? Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.